Welcome to Plastisphere, the podcast on plastics, people, and the planet. My name is Anja. In this episode, I want to talk about the elephant in the room, production. Because when we look at plastic pollution, it's really very closely connected to how much plastic is being produced. And if we want to tackle the plastic pollution issue, we cannot only talk about the end of the game when plastic has already become waste. We need to talk about how much plastic we consume and produce. My guests today are Melanie Bergmann from the Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany. She's a marine biologist, and Kristian Syberg, an environmental scientist from Roskilde University. Melanie, we've known each other for quite some years. And I remember over 10 years ago when I first interviewed you, you were actually very vocal about this topic of production. You said, well, if we want to solve this topic, maybe we need to think about reducing production. And it's quite unbelievable, but back then, you really were the only one who said that so directly. Most other people would talk about recycling, sustainable consumption, and so forth, but nobody really named this elephant in the room. As a marine biologist, you were researching the deep sea floor of the Arctic Ocean, right? And that's where you first discovered plastic pollution. So tell me about that and when it started to dawn on you that we really have to think about production.
Yeah, so we run a deep sea observatory west of Svalbard, so it's a very remote place of the world. And when I was looking through our images that we took in different years, I basically saw that there was an increase over time. So this really rang my alarm bells, and I started to look more closely into it. And yeah, if you see that there's an increase over time, and actually we don't have so much time series data, generally speaking, to look at. So we don't know so much about the temporal trends. But yeah, if you even see these increases in very remote regions, then that points to that there's a link between production, basically. So, and it is common sense, of course. If you produce a material that doesn't go away, then it is there to stay. So, and if you want to tackle the problem, it's the easiest way to reduce the problem, basically. And yeah, I just didn't know why this wasn't said more, but I did realize, because I did have a lot of media attention, that quite often when I would say this in interviews, this would be cut out, for instance. So that was interesting.
That's really interesting. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is? I mean, I remember I had that little quote in my feature where you said, well, I guess we got to start reducing production.
It's not popular, I guess, because our economy is built on growth. And that's, yeah, actually, if you really look at it, it's a degrowth issue. And maybe at the time we didn't actually have scientific data to support this as well. Later on, there came some reports or scientific studies, more to the point, which actually supported my common sense kind of statement. But yeah, because I'm not the kind of, my research isn't making these mass balances and things like this. So this was more like a hypothesis, let's say, at that stage.
So you mean your hypothesis was that the two are connected, that plastic production probably leads to more plastic pollution?
Yeah, I mean, it's a no-brainer for material that is persistent, basically, that it doesn't go away.
Well, we do have recycling, right? And so I think many people, including me, for many years believed that a lot of this plastic gets recycled and that it's, doesn't have to lead to more pollution necessarily because it's being reused over and over again. Kristian, you've been working on recycling a lot and you're an environmental planner as well. When did you start thinking about this issue of production and volumes as opposed to, well, we can just recycle our way out of this issue?
I think that in our work, we work with both understanding the causes and the consequences of pollution, but also look into potential solutions to that. And obviously, a lot of people, as you mentioned, speak about recycling as a solution, and it's appealing, because what recycling could do, if it really worked, was that it wouldn't have to change those production systems that Melanie are also talking about now, because we could just reuse our materials and we didn't have to sort of slow down in our consumption. That's what's so appealing about that. The problem with it is that recycling of plastic is not very effective, and that's because even though plastic are a persistent material in the environment, it's not a very good material to be recycled, and there's two main reasons for that. The first one is that there's a lot of chemicals, additives added to plastics. This is one of the reasons why it can be used to so many different things, because it has a very high capacity to hold different chemicals that changes the property of material. That's why we can use it everywhere. But it also means that these chemicals give these properties, and then it's not so easy to use the plastic for something differently afterwards. Just a simple example, if you put a colorant in that, then it will keep this color, or if you mix different colors, then you end up with black plastic that can be used for, plastic cans to throw at trash or something like that, but nothing else really. So it will be downcycling. It will be used for something that's of poor quality. And also the plastic in itself, the polymers, they lose material properties very, very quickly. So plastic is not a very good material to actually recycle. And we can see this by the level of recycling we have, which is less than 10% on a global scale. And even in a country like Denmark, it's less than 15-17%, something like that, even though we have put a lot of effort into that. So in that way, it's not a way we can really reduce all the materials that we consume. And so that's the problem with recycling of plastics. And then there's a fundamental problem with recycling in itself, and that is that it focuses on end of life. That means when you build businesses around recycling, if they are to be successful, they require more and more material. So if you build recycling plants, it sort of keep on accelerating the demand for material to flow through society. And that means we don't slow down, we just continue to grow. And this is why these projections moving forward, where OECD has projected that by 2060 we might end up with a global effectiveness of 17% of recycling. It will still not even reduce the amount of plastic waste that we generate, because the continued acceleration of production would mean that we would probably produce twice as much waste, and we will see twice as much littering into the environment. So this is why recycling is not the solution.
And just to illustrate the point, I think, many people think we need to slow down, and they don't realize that it's increasing all the time, 4% every year. And in numbers, this means that Ciel reported that there will be 1,200 more plastic plants being built until 2027. That's a huge number. And once we have these facilities, we have these lock-in effects, because then people will argue that if we close them down, there will be unemployment, and we've made these investments, all these kind of effects, and it will be ever more difficult to slow down.
We have seen this before, for example, in Denmark, where I come from, and also other places, especially in Europe. We have invested a lot since the 1970s in waste-to-energy systems, so incineration, and this is exactly the same kind of lock-in that we have generated with the waste incineration plants. And in Denmark, we are now in a situation where we are lacking waste. We have to import waste from Ireland in order to keep our plants going. So sometimes you say that you have to keep on feeding the beast once you have made these things. And this will be the same thing if we invest massively in recycling all over the world.
Plastics are really good fuel, right, for waste-to-energy plants. They actually need a certain amount of plastics, right?
Yes, but there we have another problem that people don't really talk about. I mean, in our part of the world, if you incinerate waste, at least you filter out the nasties. But the nasties are not just a small filter with a few things on it. These are huge quantities because we burn so much. There's tons and tons of it. I don't have numbers. I'm not even sure if there are numbers available on this, globally speaking. And in Germany, at least, these are put into some sort of salt dome, which are supposedly safe for storage. But I mean, we've seen with nuclear waste that these things often are not quite so safe, especially when the Earth is changing. Now that we have climate change, I mean, even the rocks aren't so safe, and everything is kind of working because glaciers are melting, and this causes changes in these environments. And then we have this super toxic legacy for generations to come. And who knows if they will actually know where the stuff is.
Exactly, yeah. So you have like, in some parts of the world with incinerators that don't have filters that are good enough, you have this very toxic air pollution, and the communities living around this are especially affected by that. And then even in a country like Germany, where we live, Melanie, there's still this toxic, highly toxic sludge that has to be deposited basically in the same storage spaces underground where nuclear waste is being stored, because it's so dangerous or so toxic.
And I think it's important to understand that there are two aspects of this. We talk about the pollution, which is really, really important, and then there is the material consumption part, right? And if when we incinerate plastics, for example, it's the same as burning oil, and we know the implications of that. So it's not a solution if we want to have the oil to stay in the ground, and I think most people agree that this should be the aim for us.
Oh my God, that reminds me of an idea that was once, somebody asked me, what do you think about that idea? Couldn't plastics be like a great carbon sequestration place?
There are people that work with what's called CCU, so carbon capture and storage. Some are suggesting that we capture CO2 and store it, make plastic and store that in the ground. I don't believe that that's a very viable way forward.
And in my institute, people are working on projects farming seaweeds to capture CO2 from the air and use these algal mass to produce some sort of polymer. I just hope that it will be really biodegradable and not contain toxins to avoid regrettable outcomes.
So let's go to this material side of things, because what we really have to talk about is the volumes. They're just growing and growing, and we're not really able as a society to keep up with that. And I think the moment that I realized that recycling wouldn't be enough was this study that you just mentioned, when it was like 10% is like all that has been. Less than 10% has been recycled since 1950 to 2015. And then I also, watched these whistleblower documentaries where people from the plastics industry actually openly, like from back then in the 80s, openly talked about how they did not believe in recycling back then, but they promoted it in order to keep producing. So this colleague of mine I spoke to about the topic, he asked me this very simple question. He's like, okay, well, so if it's about production, and if production is growing, and I showed him this chart where like the projections for 2050 or 60, he's like, but what are they going to make out of all that stuff? Like, why do we need like 3 times or 2 times more plastics in a couple of decades? And so I was like, wow, that's such a good question. I don't know. Where's all that plastic going? Have you ever looked into this question of like, what should be made out? Why is the growth so big?
So the projections and what we see now is that the main area of growth is within packaging, which is already now the biggest consumer of plastics. And a lot of that is single use. And that also shows us what the solution will be, because if we tackle packaging, if we tackle single-use products, then we can solve a lot of the problems there, because this is the area of expansion, and we see plastic everywhere. But everywhere we go in the world, cheap plastic packaging has replaced other solutions that we have before, right? So both solutions that were maybe made out of more natural products, but also solutions that were reusable solutions, has been replaced by single-use plastics. And I think the beverage industry is a really good example, where a company like Coca-Cola are the biggest producer of plastic bottles, and we find them everywhere. And we had Coca-Cola before that. We had this massive increase in plastic bottles, right? So it's a shift towards a system where we have this single-use plastic that is so cheap and so easy to produce and available in full abundance. So that's why it enters a market, because it's a really good business model in the current system here. And that will continue to increase because it's easy for the producer and for the consumer. You can just throw it away, but also because we have systems that sort of protect that. There's massive subsidizing going into oil extraction and also to plastic production that sort of help this part of the industry really be very competitive. And that is why you will see this growth in this type of product that you can call of very low value. And that's why sometimes when you hear, no, we need to protect the plastic industry because we have essential plastics in windmills and green transportation and in healthcare, these kind of things, then yeah, sure, we need that. And that's not the main problem. The main problem is the convenience growth in packaging that we have already seen now, and that will expand into the future.
Yeah, just to add to that, because often it's said that it's the consumer who demands it, but it's actually supply driven. We do have scientific evidence that shows this. So it's out on the market. And something else that we were told when talking with industry representatives was that maybe they didn't see the growth potential so much in the global north. Maybe the market was kind of saturated. But even if you continue just at current levels, which they don't, it's still building up, it's accumulating, it's not going away. But the biggest margin for growth was seen in the global south. So they argue that the people living there deserve to have the same standard of living, meaning exposure to toxins, if you're cynical. And therefore, there has to be growth. Yeah, this is what's going on. But the problem is that they don't have the same infrastructures. And even in our parts of the world, where we have so much investment in waste collection and recycling and all the rest of it, our systems don't scale up because we still export some waste to other countries. Now it's apparently going to Turkey, the German plastic, or some part of the plastic at least. So yeah, we will see a big increase in the global south, and this causes demand for infrastructures tackling this problem, and this will be billions of dollars. I don't have a number. Maybe Kristian, you have one. But it will be super expensive and it will never scale up. How is it going to be? I just cannot imagine it.
Yeah, what I find striking, just to pick up on one of your points, is that in our current system, producers can just go into any country without really having to worry what happens with their products at the end of the product's use. So I did this historic research at some point, and I found this very old late 1960s conference or around 1970s conference by industry on plastics in the environment. And it was interesting. It was like an article collection, and there was actually somebody from a communal waste management company, or a communal waste management institution, who was saying, well, we're getting all these new materials, we're getting all this new stuff, and we really we really don't know what to do with it, and we're left to figure out how to dispose of it. And it has remained the same thing. And I mean, we call this in the academic field, I guess, the externalities. They are put upon the communities who can then pay for waste management. And I guess we have learned to assume that that's also not a thing of the producers to pay for. It is the thing of our taxes. So I find that very interesting. And to pick up on another point, I just want to comment on some points because it's so many interesting aspects. This other point about, the global south needing so much plastic. This has been an argument I've heard for the past 10 years from industry. They would say, but do you want to take away development from these people who deserve it? So that was often used as a counter-argument. But when you talk to some of the representatives from the Global South who are working on plastic pollution, no, they don't want all these sachets flying around in their environment.
And they had better regulations in place already. I mean, countries like Rwanda and Kenya, they had for instance, plastic bag bans. I mean, there's only one little aspect of plastics, but still much earlier, I think in 2008 already, and we were still discussing things. So yeah, they're actually quite progressive.
Right. And I remember, I think the first country to ban plastic bags was Bangladesh, right? I think 2008 or so, somewhere around that. Bangladesh actually banned them because it's a country very prone to flooding. Yeah. And they were clogging the systems there. And so that was worsening the situation with flooding. A lot to deconstruct here. Kristian, what do you want to add?
And no, it's just about when we talk about this link between production and pollution. I think another thing that is important to emphasize is that we have really strong scientific evidence now that demonstrate that the pollution we find in the environment with plastic is mainly due to products that are single-use products. That's what we find there. And what we can learn from that is that if products don't have a value once they reach end of life, then the risk of them ending up as pollution is massively increased. And we have seen this. We have seen studies where we have compared the amount of, for example, bottles that we find in a country like Denmark, where there is an effective deposit refund systems, much lower quantities of plastic bottles in the environment compared to other places where there's no refund system. So that's a simple example, but what it illustrates is that if we tackle this massive increase in packaging, in single-use packaging, we are also tackling the most polluting part, at least if we look at the pollution of the plastic products we find in the environment. So addressing that can both sort of cut the curve of the growing production and at the same time mitigate the products that are most likely to end up at the pollution in the environment.
Although the second biggest market is construction, right? And I've learned from somebody working on that actually the assumption that the plastics used in buildings and in construction and infrastructure that they last for, 35 years, is actually not true anymore. So they are becoming more and more short-lived as well. So I think, yeah, you're right. The low-hanging fruits are the single-use products, but we also have to think about the other areas.
Absolutely, and what you can see is many, for example, in construction, we also build with materials now that doesn't last as long. We don't build houses to last as long as we used to do, right? So this also keeps sort of the whole production economy growing. If we continue to need to build new stuff all the time, there is a lot of studies that also shows that, for example, it is much more expensive to build new houses than to renovate, but we're still building new. And plastic is a symptom of that approach to economy that we have today, where it's driven by accelerated consumptions of material. And that way, that's really what we need to address. We need to detach these two things, that our well-being and our growth, however we determined to measure that in society, is so closely linked to material consumption as it is today, because that's really the cause of all the environmental problems that we see today.
Right. I think the moment that I really understood the relevance of this growth aspect of this elephant in the room was when these 2 scenario studies came out in Science, I think in 2020 or so, and 2 different but very big research teams had actually at the same time looked at this issue of like, what are the scenarios if we continue less ambitious, more ambitious, and so forth with all the solution approaches that we have. And basically what they found is that if growth just continues, then we're just going to not be able to keep up with the solutions we have right now. We can't improve recycling, we can't clean up, we can't incinerate, and so forth fast enough to keep up with this immense growth, right? So having understood that, I think I also became more outspoken about the fact that I think, we need to tackle production. And we actually collaborated on a letter to Science asking to cap plastic production. And you guys are both members of the Scientist Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty. So you have now been following this process for a very long time. What can you tell me about how we can actually achieve or how we can actually tackle production? What are the different pathways?
If we talk with companies, industries all over, then there are a lot of them that actually wants to find different solutions. But right now, they are locked into this system of continuing with this close link between cheap plastic production and economic growth for them. So if they try to innovate into the market, it's a closed door for them. And that's why we need a treaty to sort of open that door. And there's a lot of, in the area of transition science, there's a lot of examples of how environmental regulation can actually foster green innovation. And this is what this treaty can do if it's an ambitious treaty. And that is because this is sometimes we talk, and this is such a negative narrative. No, we have to decrease our way of living. We have to change our way of living. It's not going to be worse. We are already in a situation where we are contaminating the environment and ourselves. So we have to change that. And that doesn't mean that we have to live in a poor life, but we have to use the materials much smarter than we do today, so we don't overconsume so much. And we need global treaty to sort of give that foundation for the businesses and for people living on the planet. That's why we are here.
So there's been demands and talk of a cap on plastic production. There's the idea of breaking free from plastics. We could slow growth and still grow plastic, or we could reduce it. So from a scientist's perspective, what do you think we need to do, and how would we best do it?
Yeah, I think there are 2 aspects to that. First of all, we need to, where we use plastic should be only where it's essential. I think that's one part of that. But we also have to remember that right now, plastic is based on fossil fuels. And we want to reduce that. We want to stop pulling oil out of the ground. So we need, and this is why we need this whole foundation for innovation, because sometimes it can be difficult to see what a future could be like, and it has to be completely different than what we have now, right? We have to look into something different. So we have to have a system where the plastics that we are used are fossil free, and it's only used for essential. And how big is that? We don't know that, because we don't know exactly what is essential. And something can be essential now. For example, we can have water supply systems in an area where there is not enough infrastructure for other water. That is essential now and not in the future. So that's not like a fixed number. But the point is we have to move over to using only plastic where it is really essential for us, and then have a transition away from fossil-based plastics as well. That is what we need.
From a climate emission point of view, I would say we need a reduction in production, because at the moment, production of plastics alone costs us 5% of our annual CO2 emissions. So this is more than the flight sector. And it's projected, if we grow as projected, then that would cost something between 20 to 30% of our remaining CO2 budget. So this is a lot. And to stay within our climate goals, one study showed we need to reduce in between 12 to 70% of the production. So this is just to stay within the Paris Agreement. We haven't thought about biodiversity impacts and all these things which come on top of that, of course. For these, we don't really have good data right now. So it's hard to put a good number on this, but I think these climate points are a good indicator of where we could go.
Great. So what I learned from you is that the less we use, the better. We should really see what's really essential, what we can't cut, and then cut everything else. Single-use plastics is a low-hanging fruit, but we also have to look at the other kinds of plastics, the other uses of plastics. Pollution and production are related, they are connected. And because it's not always the demand that drives this production, we also need global rules. And ideally, this would be in the form of a treaty that actually tackles production, right?
Exactly.
Thank you so much to both of you, Melanie Bergmann and Kristian Syberg, for your important work on the topic and for being such important public voices as well.
Thanks for inviting me, Anja.
Yes, thank you, Anja, and also thank you for your work.